My mother set two black garbage bags on the top step of the carriage house at 7 in the morning, side by side, like she'd measured the distance between them with a ruler. "You'll want to take what's yours before 10, she said. "The Hendersons are coming through at 10:30, and I'd rather they didn't see all this." I spent 29 years believing that if I stayed useful enough, quiet enough, patient enough, somebody in that house would eventually decide I'd earned a permanent place in it. If you've ever done that math on your own worth and come up short in front of people who were supposed to love you first, you already know how this story goes. And if you want to hear how it ends, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I tell a lot of these. I'm an architect. For most of my 20s, the title lived on paycheck stubs more than business cards, because I spent 6 years doing accessibility retrofits for a firm that mostly worked with insurance clients. Ramps, stair lifts, walk-in showers, doorways widened for wheelchairs that hadn't arrived yet but would. I'm good at a specific, unglamorous kind of seeing. I can stand in a room and picture not what it is, but what somebody's body is going to need from it in 5 years. That instinct came out of my grandfather's house long before it came out of any classroom. By the morning my mother lined up those bags, I'd redesigned 4 rooms of that house myself, permits pulled under my own license, so my grandfather could keep living in it instead of in a facility. I never asked anyone to pay me for the work. I never thought I'd have to prove I'd done it. My grandfather, Henry Coleman, had his first stroke 3 years before that morning on the porch. He recovered most of his speech within 4 months and most of his left-hand grip within 8, but he never fully trusted stairs again, and my mother, his daughter-in-law, the one who'd run his household for 2 decades, decided the second floor of his own house wasn't a conversation worth having with him. I was the one who moved into the carriage house behind the main house that spring, ostensibly to help out for a while. 3 years later, I was still there, and a while had never once been redefined out loud. The first real crack showed at Thanksgiving that same year, 4 months after the stroke, when my mother, Donna, stood at the head of the table, carving a turkey she hadn't cooked, and told my Aunt Helen, in front of 11 people, that it must be nice to live somewhere rent-free at 26. Since February, I'd covered $340 a month toward the house's utilities, and that same year, I'd paid $6,200 out of my own savings for a stair lift Medicare wouldn't touch. I said none of that at the table. I passed the cranberry sauce instead. A year later, my brother Justin put a down payment on a house of his own, $45,000, wired to him in one transfer that my mother mentioned so casually at a barbecue that I nearly missed it. When I asked, mildly, whether there was a similar fund anywhere with my name attached to it, my mother laughed in a way that wasn't really a laugh and said, "Justin has a family to think about, Rachel. Some people are just more responsible with money than others." I had, at that point, $4,000 in a savings account and a full-time caregiving schedule stacked on top of a full-time job. I said nothing to that either. What I told myself, on the nights it got hard to keep telling myself anything, was that none of it was really about me. It was about my grandfather. He was 81 that year and slowing down in ways that scared me more than I let on, and every dollar and every silence felt like a fair trade for the time I still had with him. The two of us at his workbench on Sunday afternoons, him narrating 40 years of contracting stories, while I sanded down whatever project he'd started and couldn't quite finish alone anymore. My Aunt Helen saw more of it than I gave her credit for at the time. She called me on a Tuesday in October, 2 years into my living there, and said, without much preamble, "Your mother's always resented that he'd rather talk to you than to her. I've watched it for 30 years. Don't let her make you feel small for being the one he picked." I thanked her and told her it wasn't that serious. I believed that mostly, because believing anything else would have meant admitting how much of my life I'd already spent absorbing it. There was a Christmas, the year before he died, when my mother organized a family portrait session with a photographer she'd hired for $200 an hour. My parents, Justin, his wife, their 2 kids, my grandfather in his wheelchair at the center. I was the one who'd gotten him dressed that morning, who'd wheeled him down the ramp I'd designed myself, who stood behind the photographer's tripod adjusting the angle so the afternoon light wouldn't wash out his face. When the prints came back 3 weeks later, framed copies went to Justin's house, to my Aunt Helen's, to my parents' own hallway. I never got one. When I finally asked my mother about it, she looked truly puzzled, like the omission hadn't required a decision at all, and said, "I didn't think you'd want one, you're always here anyway." I bought a copy from the photographer myself for $60 and kept it in a drawer instead of on a wall, because looking at it too long made something in my chest go tight in a way I didn't have a name for yet. My grandfather died 8 months before the morning with the garbage bags. Quietly, in his sleep at 83, in the bed I'd helped move to the ground floor 2 years earlier so he wouldn't have to face those stairs at all. I was the one who found him, and I was the one who, 3 days later, sat in a folding chair at his funeral while my mother told the pastor, loudly enough for the second row to hear, that the family had cared for him together, right to the end. That too, I let stand. I'd let almost everything stand for 3 years, and the habit didn't break just because he had died. What I didn't know, sitting in that folding chair, was that my grandfather had spent 11 years making sure I'd never have to let anything stand again. At 2:17 that same afternoon, the afternoon of the garbage bags, I was sitting in my car outside a storage facility on Route 9, surrounded by 4 boxes and 2 black bags that apparently constituted 29 years of belonging somewhere, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Coleman, my name is Patrick Grant. I was your grandfather's attorney." His voice had the careful, unhurried register of someone who delivered a lot of difficult sentences over the phone and learned to slow down for all of them. "I need about 40 minutes of your time today, if you can manage it. It concerns the property at 14 Birchwood Lane." I told him my mother was showing that property to buyers in about 2 hours. There was a pause on the line just long enough to mean something. "That's actually why I'm calling now instead of next week," he said. "Can you come to my office?" 40 minutes later, I was sitting across a desk from a man I'd met exactly twice before, both times at family functions where he'd been introduced as Henry's lawyer, and nothing more, while he slid a folder toward me and said the sentence that undid 11 years of a story I hadn't known I was living inside. My grandfather had placed the house into an irrevocable trust the year after his first cardiac scare, 11 years before that afternoon, naming me as sole trustee and sole beneficiary, effective immediately upon his death. The deed had never belonged to my mother, or my father, or the estate my mother believed she was settling. It had belonged to me since the morning after his funeral, and to nobody else since the day he signed it. I didn't cry in that office. I read the trust twice, then a third time, my architect's eye running the same way it did over a set of drawings, checking the load-bearing language, the recording date, the notary stamp, until I trusted what it said more than I trusted my own shock. Patrick watched me do it without interrupting. When I finally looked up, he said, "He asked me to wait until you truly left the house before I told you." His words. He didn't want you staying out of obligation to a piece of paper. He wanted you to leave believing you had nothing, and then find out you'd had everything the whole time. None of it reached my mother that afternoon or that week. I told exactly one person, Amanda Wilson, a structural engineer I'd worked alongside for 6 years, and the closest thing I had to family that wasn't legally required to disappoint me. And I told her because I needed someone with a level head to confirm I wasn't imagining a way out of my own humiliation. Amanda read the trust documents at her kitchen table on a Sunday night, asked 4 sharp questions Patrick later confirmed I'd been right to ask myself, and then said, "Rachel, your mother is currently under contract to sell a house she does not own. Do you understand what that means for her, legally, the second the buyer's title company runs a search?" I understood. I also understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that I wasn't going to warn her. What I did instead, over the 6 weeks between that phone call and the closing date Brenda Sanders had already locked in with the Hendersons, was documentation, 3 years of utility receipts, $16,000 in medical and home modification costs I'd covered without ever asking to be repaid, the permits filed under my own architect's license for the ground floor bedroom conversion. Patrick told me none of it was strictly necessary. The trust was airtight on its own. I gathered it anyway, because I'd spent 3 years being told my contributions didn't count, and some part of me needed them counted now, even in a file nobody but me would ever open. There was one Thursday, 4 weeks in, when I nearly didn't make it through dinner. My mother had invited me, a small, strange kindness that felt more like reconnaissance than an olive branch, And I sat across the table from her while she talked about paint colors for the Hendersons' walkthrough and whether the dining set would fetch more sold separately. I passed her the salad and asked about Justin's kids, and I said nothing about the folder sitting in my car, 4 feet from where she was planning the last details of selling a house that had stopped being hers the moment my grandfather signed his name 11 years earlier. I went home afterward and sat in my car in the dark for 20 minutes before I could make myself walk inside. On a Tuesday during that same stretch, I drove to the county recorder's office on my lunch break and pulled the deed history myself, the way I'd pull a permit file for any other job, and sat in my car afterwards staring at the recording stamp from 11 years earlier, Henry Coleman, grantor, to the Coleman Family Trust, grantee, until a parking enforcement officer knocked on my window to ask if I was all right. I told her I was fine, which wasn't a lie, exactly. I just didn't have a shorter answer. Justin called me twice during those 6 weeks, both times about small things, a leaking faucet at his own house, whether I thought the Hendersons would want the porch swing thrown in with the sale, and both times I came within a sentence of telling him everything before I stopped myself. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I'd watched him spend 3 years choosing the version of our family that was easier to live inside, and I wasn't willing to hand him a truth he might carry straight back to our mother before I was ready for her to have it. I want you to understand something before we get to the part where she finds out. I wasn't building toward revenge. I was building toward proof. Stay with me, because the day it finally came due, everyone my mother invited to witness her sale ended up witnessing something else entirely. And if you've ever waited that long to be believed, leave the date in the comments when we get there. The closing was scheduled for a Wednesday, 11 in the morning, at a title company office off Route 22, and my mother had turned it into something closer to a small celebration than a real estate transaction. She'd invited my father, my brother Justin, my Aunt Helen, so we can finally put the whole chapter behind us, she told Helen on the phone, a call Helen later repeated to me nearly word for word. And Brenda Sanders sat at the head of the conference table with a folder of her own, cheerfully oblivious, next to the young couple who'd agreed to pay $419,000 for a house that had never been my mother's to sell. I arrived at 10:55 with Patrick Grant beside me, carrying the same folder he'd shown me 6 weeks earlier, and I watched my mother's face do 3 things in under 4 seconds: surprise, irritation, and then, when she registered who was walking in beside me, something closer to fear than either of those. "Rachel, this is a closing, not a family reunion," she said, already reaching for damage control in a voice pitched for the room. "I don't know what you think you're." "Mrs. Coleman," the title officer interrupted, looking up from her own screen with the particular stillness of someone who has just found something in a record search that changes the shape of a room. "Before we go any further, I need to flag something." The title search came back showing this property was transferred into an irrevocable trust 11 years ago. It's not part of Henry Coleman's estate. It never was. Patrick set the folder on the table and slid it toward the title officer. And then, because he'd promised me he would say it plainly and not soften it for anyone's comfort, he said it plainly. Henry Coleman placed 14 Birchwood Lane into a trust naming his granddaughter, Rachel Coleman, as sole trustee and sole beneficiary, effective on his death. Mrs. Coleman does not hold title to this property and has not for 11 years. Any contract for its sale is void. Nobody spoke for a length of time I could have measured. Brenda Sanders looked down at her own folder like it might contradict the room, then back up, then said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I need to call my broker." The young couple exchanged a look I recognized, the specific panic of people who'd already given notice on an apartment. My father, Alan, went very still in the way he always did when he was doing math he didn't want the answer to. Justin said, "Mom, what is she talking about?" in a voice that had gone thin. My mother's composure didn't collapse all at once. It went the way ice goes on a lake in early spring, a long, quiet crack first, then a slower give, then the sound of something underneath finally taking the weight. "That's not Henry would have told me," she said. "He would have told me if he'd done something like that." "He told me," I said. It was the first full sentence I'd spoken since walking in. 11 years ago. He just didn't tell you, because he knew exactly what you do with the information while he was still alive to watch you do it. My Aunt Helen, sitting 2 seats down, put her hand flat on the table like she needed something solid under it. "Donna," she said, "did you know he'd had a cardiac scare 11 years back, before any of this, before Rachel even moved into the carriage house?" My mother didn't answer her. That, more than anything Patrick had said, seemed to be the moment the room fully understood what they were looking at. The young woman buying the house, she couldn't have been older than 31, turned to her husband and said, quietly enough that she probably thought no one else would hear it, "We gave notice on our apartment 2 weeks ago." Brenda Sanders was already on her feet with her phone against her ear, saying, "No, I need you to pull the file right now," to whoever had picked up on the other end. My mother reached for the folder in front of her like reading it herself might change what was inside it, then set it down again without opening it. 11 years, my mother said, mostly to the table, mostly to herself. "He sat across from me at dinner for 11 years and let me think this house was mine to lose sleep over." Her voice had lost the pitch she'd used for the room a minute earlier. It had gone thin and low, the way it sounds when someone is doing arithmetic they can't stop doing. "He let me plan a sale. He let me tell people. He let me humiliate." She stopped herself before the sentence finished, but everyone at that table had already heard where it was going. In the days after the closing collapsed, my mother called me 11 times. I let 4 of the calls go to voicemail and answered the 5th, mostly to hear what version of the story she'd landed on by then. It had shifted from "you tricked your grandfather" to "you let me humiliate myself in front of the whole family" to, finally, on the 6th call, something closer to honest, "I don't understand why he didn't trust me with his own house." I didn't have an answer that would have made either of us feel better, so I didn't offer one. The Hendersons, through their own attorney, filed a claim against my mother for breach of contract inside of 3 weeks, seeking recovery of the $8,400 they'd already spent on inspections, appraisal fees, and a bridge deposit on their old apartment's early termination. My mother settled it within 2 months rather than let it go further, using savings my father hadn't fully known existed, which became its own separate conversation in a marriage that had apparently been running 2 sets of books for longer than either of them had said out loud. The account she drew from held $11,000 more than my father remembered agreeing to set aside, money that had apparently been accumulating, a little at a time, against exactly this kind of emergency. He never asked her when she'd started keeping it. By then, I think, he'd already guessed the answer wasn't one he'd like. Brenda Sanders quietly dropped my mother as a client the same week the claim was filed, citing, in the careful language real estate agents use when they mean something sharper, a breakdown in the disclosure process. My mother has not, as far as I know, retained another agent since. She mentioned once, on that 6th phone call, that she'd thought about listing the house herself, before catching herself mid-sentence and remembering it had never been hers to list at all. I didn't correct her. Some silences, by that point, felt like they belonged to her to sit with, not to me. The young couple who'd nearly bought 14 Birchwood Lane found another house 2 towns over by the following spring, and Brenda, of all people, was the one who told me. She'd stayed in touch with them out of what I think was genuine guilt over how close she'd come to closing a sale that was never real. I still think about the woman's voice at that table sometimes, the flatness of "we gave notice 2 weeks ago," and I'm glad someone made sure that particular cost didn't follow them any further than it had to. Brenda told me they'd asked her, on their way out of the title company that day, whether something like this happened often. She said she didn't have a good answer for them. I didn't have one either when she asked me the same question a few days later. My Aunt Helen calls me now on the first Sunday of every month, a habit that started the week after the closing and never stopped. She doesn't talk about my mother much on those calls, and I don't ask her to. Mostly she tells me stories about my grandfather from before I was born, the summer he built the carriage house with his own hands, the year he refused to sell a plot of land to a developer for triple what it was worth, because he liked the family of foxes denning under the back fence. I think she's been waiting a long time for someone in this family to want to hear them. Justin didn't speak to her for 4 months. What finally broke that silence wasn't the house. It was learning, somewhere in the unraveling, that the $45,000 down payment he'd been given 4 years earlier had come partly from a home equity line my parents had taken out against a house that, unbeknownst to any of them, they hadn't actually owned free and clear in the way they'd assumed. The math on that took a lawyer of his own to untangle, and it cost him something he still hasn't fully said out loud to me, though I suspect it looked a great deal like the same math I'd been doing for 3 years in the carriage house. When he finally called again, in the 5th month, the first thing he said was, "I didn't know, Rachel. I want you to know I didn't know." I believed him. That was never really the question I'd been waiting on an answer to. My father moved into a rental 2 towns over in the 5th month after the closing. He didn't frame it as leaving her. Exactly, he called it taking some time to look at things clearly, which is the kind of sentence a man says when he's finally allowed himself to notice something he'd spent 31 years agreeing not to. He calls me now on Sundays, which he never used to do, and asks about the house the way a man asks about a country he used to live in. Sometimes he asks about my grandfather instead, questions he never thought to ask while there was still time for Henry to answer them himself. I hold 14 Birchwood Lane in trust the way my grandfather built it to be held, mine, outright, no mortgage, no family vote required on what happens to it next. I moved out of the carriage house in the 4th month and into the main house itself, into the ground floor bedroom I designed and permitted for a man who never got to tell me why he'd really trusted me with all of it. Word travels now among people who have watched a parent age and didn't know who to call, and I've started taking on accessibility retrofit clients under my own license instead of a firm's. My grandfather used to say a house should never lie to the person living in it about what it can hold. I think, for 11 years, he was quietly making sure this one never would. He never once explained the trust to me while he was alive, and for a long time I thought that was a withholding, one more thing kept from me by someone I trusted. I don't think that anymore. I think he'd watched 30 years of my mother deciding, out loud and in front of witnesses, exactly how little I was owed, and he'd concluded a long time before I ever moved into that carriage house that the only proof that would ever actually hold up was the kind she couldn't argue with in a room full of people. He wasn't hiding the truth from me. He was building the one version of it nobody would be able to talk me out of. I still keep that framed photograph, the one I bought for $60, the one that never made it onto anyone else's wall, but it stays in a drawer, the same drawer, because some things don't need to be looked at every day to still be true. Whether my mother and I will ever sit across a table again without one of us doing math in our heads, I truly don't know. I've stopped needing an answer to that before I can let the rest of it settle. Some nights I still catch the smell of cedar drifting up from the workshop off the garage, where his tools are still racked exactly the way he left them, and I haven't moved a single one. I don't tell this story looking for anyone to feel sorry for what happened in that carriage house. I tell it because I know there's someone listening right now who's still doing the math on their own worth in a family that keeps landing on a number too small for them, and I want that person to know the math doesn't stay wrong forever. Sometimes somebody's already fixed it, years before you find out. I'll see you in the next one.